435 members of Congress sat in silence. No movement, no whispers, just the sound of one man standing and one letter being unfolded. J.D. Vance didn't shout. He didn't point fingers. He simply read. And within 3 minutes, Maxwell Frost's career wasn't just questioned. It was cracked, cornered, and by the time he folded the letter shut, it was gone. What was written on those pages? What truth could silence a room built on noise and make the American people ask, how long have we been listening to lies? This is not just a story about politics. It's about a moment when silence said more than any speech ever could. But before we begin, a quiet note. Though the characters and events you're about to witness are dramatized, the emotions, the questions, and the urgency behind them are very, very real. Sometimes fiction tells the truth louder than facts ever will. Now, rewind to the moment before the room went still. Stay with us. What happens next might change how you see silence. Washington, D.C., 11:42 p.m. The Capitol was mostly asleep. The echo of late-night footsteps had faded down the marbled halls, and even the lobby guards had settled into the quiet rhythm of night shift boredom. But 3 floors above, in an office dimly lit by a single standing lamp and the flickering blue-white buzz of a fluorescent fixture, J.D. Vance was still awake. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up. The papers on his desk weren't neatly stacked. They looked like they'd been wrestled with, and maybe they had. He rubbed his forehead as he leaned back in his chair, scanning a housing subcommittee report for the 3rd time that day. The numbers looked off, not wildly, but off in the kind of way that made someone like J.D. pause. The kettle in the corner hissed, then whistled, a low, tired whistle. He rose to pour himself a mug of tea, not because he needed caffeine, but because staying awake felt like his only option. Then came a knock, software hesitant, almost apologetic. The door creaked open before he could answer. A junior staffer, barely out of college, clearly nervous, stood holding a manila folder marked with a red sticky tab. "Sir, I didn't mean to bother you, but you're going to want to see this." J.D. took it without a word. She didn't step inside. She just nodded and backed out, letting the door click shut behind her like a secret. He opened the folder and scanned the top page. Then again, slower this time. It was a fiscal summary attached to a veterans housing initiative, one Maxwell Frost had publicly championed just 2 weeks earlier during a live press conference. J.D. remembered Frost's exact words. "No veteran should sleep on concrete. We funded that truth." Except this report didn't back that up. J.D.'s brow furrowed. He pulled the original budget sheets Frost's office had submitted and set them side by side with the internal audit now in front of him. A red pen slid into his hand almost instinctively. He began to circle. $3.1 million listed as expanded housing outreach was in reality transferred from an aging medical facility fund. A line marked new veteran units in Florida had been duplicated from the prior year's count. Worst of all, one line item for emergency shelter access, zeroed out in the final approval phase. Frost hadn't mentioned that at all. J.D. leaned back, jaw tight. "Was this a mistake or a maneuver?" he whispered. He turned back to the folder. Tucked behind the main packet was a flagged footnote, a 1-sentence quote from an internal analyst. Reported impact metrics appear inflated when reconciled with actual disbursement activity. A bureaucratic way of saying they lied, and they hadn't expected anyone to look this close. The kettle had gone silent. The room now buzzed only with the low hum of fluorescent light and J.D.'s steady breathing. He sat still, the red pen held tightly in his hand like a fuse waiting for a spark. Outside his office window, the dome of the Capitol gleamed faintly under the moonlight. The city slept. But a story, one that could shatter reputations, had just stirred. J.D. stared at the papers, then slowly pulled out a folded letter he kept in his inside pocket. It was handwritten, torn at the top, from a veteran's widow in Ohio. Her husband had died waiting for housing that never came. She had included just one sentence underlined in blue ink. "You're the last one I believe might still care." J.D. exhaled. Some whispers never make headlines, But the right whisper in the right hands can bring the whole house down. The morning light over the Capitol wasn't golden. It was gray. The kind of gray that seeps into your bones and lingers, like a storm that hasn't quite made up its mind. JD sat at his desk, same seat as the night before, though now the mess of papers had been slightly pushed aside. He hadn't slept. Not really. Just dozed off with his jacket draped over the back of the chair and that folder still open beside him, red ink dried in tense little circles around Frost's numbers. There was a soft knock and an aide entered holding the day's mail. 2 thick envelopes from HUD, a glossy Veteran Affairs report, and 1 smaller, hand-addressed envelope, cream-colored and creased at the corners. "No return address," the aide said, setting it on top. JD nodded, dismissing him with a half-raised hand. Something about the envelope, its imperfection, its quiet, pulled at him. He picked it up and turned it over. No stamps, no frills, just his name, written slowly, carefully. He opened it. The handwriting inside trembled, not from style but from age. Ink bled slightly into the paper, as if the pen had hesitated too long on each word. It was from a woman named Evelyn Carter, a widow in Zanesville, Ohio. Her husband, Raymond Carter, had served in Vietnam. 2 tours. Came home with shrapnel in his leg and shadows in his eyes. Spent the last 2 years battling cancer and the system, trying to get approved for emergency housing support when his retirement savings dried up from medical bills. She wrote that he died in the back room of a motel last winter, a week before the letter of approval arrived. Then she quoted something, a sentence from Maxwell Frost's recent speech on Capitol Hill. JD remembered that speech. Frost had stood proud, surrounded by veterans and reporters, proclaiming, "We have fulfilled 100% of all veteran housing requests under this administration. That's not a promise. That's a fact." Evelyn had underlined that quote in blue pen. Then came her final words. "When I heard him say that, I cried, not because he was lying, but because it made me feel like my husband never existed." JD stared at the paper. He didn't blink. The room around him had fallen still again, like the air was holding its breath with him. Slowly, he folded the letter in half, pressed it flat, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, close to the chest, beneath the heart. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, DC bustled in its usual rhythm, horns blaring in the distance, staffers hurrying with lattes and briefcases, tourists snapping pictures of buildings they'd never enter. But inside this office, something had shifted, not in volume, in weight. JD turned back to his desk. He glanced at the flagged audit again, then at the crumpled budget charts, then back to the window's reflection, where his own tired face stared back at him. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just about missing money. It wasn't even about Maxwell Frost's math. It was about the kind of lie that buries people twice, once in silence and again in statistics. And something inside JD Vance had just clicked into place. It was 23 minutes before the vote. The hallway outside the chamber was unusually quiet, shielded from the hum of cameras and the orchestration of public optics. This was the corridor where deals were whispered, not shouted, where tension traveled in glances, not press releases. JD Vance stood near the far wall, arms folded, jacket back on, but still slightly wrinkled from the night before. The letter from Evelyn Carter remained tucked beneath the lining, a silent weight over his heart. Maxwell Frost exited the cloakroom, mid-conversation with a younger staffer, laughing lightly at something she said. The moment his eyes caught JD's, the grin didn't fade, but it shifted. It became something more measured, more prepared. JD stepped forward. "Congressman Frost," he said, voice even. Frost tilted his head, still smiling. "Senator Vance, what brings you down to the kid's wing?" JD didn't smile back. He held up a slim folder, just 3 pages, but all marked with notes in red ink. "You reported 100% housing fulfillment for veterans," JD said. "That's not what this shows. You padded numbers, recycled prior year metrics, cut emergency shelter lines completely in the final phase. You want to tell me why?" Frost looked at the folder without touching it. "That data," he said with a practiced shrug, "came straight from housing and urban development. Talk to them. We don't do the spreadsheets. We do the speeches." JD studied him, his eyes not moving. You knew those lines weren't true. Frost exhaled slowly and leaned against the doorframe, almost amused. Look, JD, the system's messy. People die waiting. Everyone in here knows that. You want to yell about it, be my guest. But don't act like you're the first person to find a flaw in a government report. JD's jaw tensed. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But something in Frost's ease, the smoothness, the casual polish, made the whole hallway feel colder. He's too smooth, JD thought. Not slippery, not defensive. Just too smooth. He didn't say another word. Just closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and turned to walk away. Behind him, Frost's aide, barely out of her 20s, clutching a clipboard, whispered not quite quietly enough. He's just trying to make a moment. JD stopped, turned his head slightly over his shoulder. His voice was quiet, not performative, just true. No, he said, I'm trying to fix one. And then he walked on. He didn't look back, didn't need applause or confrontation. But as he made his way toward the floor, past towering paintings of men who had stood in that chamber before him, JD's mind wasn't on the vote. It was on a motel room in Ohio, on a man who never got his approval letter, on a widow who wrote by hand because she didn't trust that emails ever got read, and on a line that echoed louder than anything Frost had said. It made me feel like my husband never existed. That couldn't be spun, couldn't be dodged, couldn't be buried under press kits and talking points. JD Vance didn't have a moment to make. He had a reckoning to deliver, and now it was coming. The hearing room was packed, shoulder to shoulder, suited bodies with pinned smiles and waiting microphones. The air had that recycled chill common to federal buildings, but under the lights it always ran a little warm. Cameras blinked red from the corners. C-SPAN was live. The American public, or at least the part that still cared, would be watching. Maxwell Frost adjusted his tie, stood up straight, and stepped into the spotlight with the smoothness of someone born to hold it. Behind him, a large monitor displayed a crisp title slide, Delivering on the Promise, Veterans Housing Progress Report, Fiscal Year 2024. Then came the visuals, chart after chart, colorful, clean, orange bars stretching taller than last year's, green arrows climbing upward, smiling veterans stock photoed beside line items that read 98.6% housing placement rate, 0 shelter denials in Frost District, emergency access turnaround, down 40%. Each claim landed like a soft drumbeat, confident, unapologetic. As we continue building systems that reflect our values, Frost said, gesturing with an open palm, we're seeing not just promises, but results. The numbers speak for themselves. Applause scattered softly at the back of the room. JD Vance didn't clap. He sat still, hands folded, jacket buttoned, eyes narrow beneath furrowed brows. He wasn't watching the screen. He was watching Frost. The voice was perfectly modulated, the tone ideal for headlines. Historic efficiency, streamlined delivery, compassionate scale. But to JD, the phrasing felt too polished, the transitions too well rehearsed. The language was theater, not testimony. JD's eyes drifted to the binder Frost's team had distributed before the hearing. He flipped to the footnotes, page 14. There it was again, small, easy to miss. Statistical modeling based on projected capacity using blended annualized data from fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024 cycles. A bureaucratic way of saying, this isn't exactly real. This is what we hope it will look like. JD made no expression, but his pen tapped once against his notepad. Software rhythmic. Frost continued, and I want to be clear, our office has never turned away a veteran request in need. Not one. We've honored every call, every case, every file. On screen, another slide faded in. A quote in bold white font. We don't build shelter numbers. We build dignity. Representative Maxwell Frost. JD leaned back in his chair slightly, crossing one leg over the other. He wasn't preparing to speak. Not yet. He was preparing to remember, to catalog every word. Because beneath all this polish, beneath the light-reflecting graphs and curated slogans, He felt something raw pressing against the inside of his chest. It was the same tension he felt reading Evelyn Carter's letter. The same silence he carried from that late-night audit folder. The same quiet weight in the phrase, "It made me feel like my husband never existed." He scanned the room. The press nodded, pens moving in rhythm with Frost's cadence. A few committee members offered approving glances. Staffers whispered notes to one another. On the surface, it all looked exactly as it should, progress being proudly measured and displayed. But JD saw something else. He saw metrics without people, movement without meaning, applause that didn't belong to truth, but to style, and so he stayed silent. Not because he agreed, but because he was waiting for the right silence to break. And when it did, it wouldn't be with a speech. It would be with a sentence. Maybe just one. One sentence that would pull the curtain back on this theater and show America what had been buried beneath the numbers all along. Back upstairs, the room wasn't filled with lights and cameras anymore. It was lit by desk lamps and computer screens, humming machines, and the low murmur of quiet outrage. JD had returned from the hearing without a word. He handed the glossy Veterans Housing Progress Report to his chief of staff like it was evidence from a crime scene. "We're not looking for headline," he said. "We're looking for the trick." Now that's what the team was doing. 4 aides, 1 pot of bad coffee, and a stack of spreadsheets tall enough to drown in. Frost's report sat in the middle of the table like a grinning mask. Surrounding it were original HUD data sets, past quarterly allocations, and appropriations notes dating back 2 fiscal years. Pages flipped, pens clicked, highlighters dragged across line items in orange, yellow, red. JD stood behind them, pacing. Not frantically, patiently, like a prosecutor waiting for a witness to fold. A young analyst named Daniel finally muttered, "I found it." Everyone looked up. He turned his monitor. Page 11, footnote 4 in Frost's submission. It lists additional shelter units allocated Q3 as a direct increase. JD leaned in. "So?" Daniel pointed to the line. "Those are the exact same units approved in Q3 of last year. They just repeated the number. They duplicated last year's data and relabeled it." JD took a breath, jaw locking. "Show me another." Maya, the legislative aide seated to his left, raised a hand. Cross-category bundling in Section 7. They moved funds from veteran medical housing to temporary youth shelter initiatives, and then counted both as new allocations for veterans. Technically legal, deeply dishonest. JD opened his own copy of the report, flipped to Section 7, and circled it in red ink. Then he did it again. And again. The page began to bleed. "This isn't a mistake," he muttered. "This is engineered." He sat down and began flipping through page by page, red pen in hand like a scalpel. Funding that looked like expansion was actually redistribution. Terms like provisional access masked wait lists over 90 days long. Graphs labeled fulfillment were anchored in projections, not completions. It was a well-built illusion, beautifully staged. But JD had seen enough political illusions to know when one was being weaponized. He reached page 23, skimmed a spreadsheet formatted by ZIP code, and paused. There, under Frost's own district, one line read, "Status denied. Application date, November 8th. Applicant R. Carter, Zanesville, Ohio." JD's heart stopped for half a second. He reached for the letter in his jacket pocket. The name, the date, the place. Same man, same denial, same silence. He looked up at the team. No one was speaking now. No one needed to. There was no need for grandstanding, no need to raise voices. The truth was sitting right there, plain and devastating. "We're not dealing with mismanagement," JD said quietly. "We're dealing with fabrication, or at the very least, deception dressed in patriotic language." He closed the folder. The red ink on the pages made it look almost like a wound. Outside the window, dusk was settling over D.C. The glow of the Capitol dome was beginning to flicker on. Inside, J.D. Vance sat back, one hand on the letter in his chest pocket, the other still gripping the pen like a gavel. The hearing was public. But the verdict? That would come soon, and it wouldn't need applause to echo. The building was nearly empty again. Long after the hearings had ended and the cameras had powered down, J.D. Vance remained. The silence of the Capitol at night was a different kind of silence than in the day. Less performative, more honest. The kind that settled into the cracks of the walls and whispered things the daytime never allowed. J.D.'s office lights were low, just one corner lamp casting a warm halo across his desk. The air was still, save for the faint ticking of an old wall clock and the occasional groan of the ductwork overhead. On his desk sat a legal pad, a half-drunk mug of coffee, and the letter from Evelyn Carter, unfolded and resting in the same place it had been all day, like it was waiting to be spoken for. He stood in front of the window at first, tie loosened, jacket off, one hand on his hip. He looked out toward the dome, its glow steady and patient, and began speaking, not loudly, not even formally, just enough to feel the words come alive outside his head. "There's a difference between numbers and names," he said, voice quiet but anchored. "One can be massaged, the other bleeds." He paused, turned, crossed the room slowly, thinking aloud. "You can't build trust on inflated charts. You can't bury a denial form under a slide deck and call it compassion." He picked up the report Frost had distributed, the glossy one, held it like a prop, then tossed it on the desk with a dull slap. "That's not a plan," he said. "That's a costume." His voice was rising now, just slightly. He let the silence rebound around the office, testing it, adjusting his tone like a musician tuning a worn violin. He picked up Evelyn's letter and held it in both hands. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. He already knew every line. "You said you funded every request," he muttered almost to himself, "but her husband never saw a bed, never saw a call returned, never saw his country acknowledge his name." J.D.'s eyes shifted toward the bookshelf in the corner, where a small photo frame leaned against a row of political biographies. He walked toward it slowly. It was a black and white picture. His grandfather, Private Harold Vance in uniform, straight-backed, jaw set, eyes squinting toward the sun on some forgotten base in South Korea. J.D. picked up the frame and stared at it for a long moment. Then he whispered, "This can't be about him." He set the photo down. "It has to be about all of them." He turned back to the desk, sat down, picked up his pen, and began underlining key phrases in his notes. Not promises, patterns, not performance, proof. His handwriting wasn't neat, but it had weight. He practiced again, softer this time. "We don't get to choose who matters. We only get to choose whether we notice when they're missing." He looked up. The city outside blinked and moved on without him. But in here, something was sharpening. This wouldn't be a moment of rage. It wouldn't be a soundbite. If he was going to say something on that floor, it had to be something that stayed, something that echoed even after the mics were turned off. He folded the letter gently, placed it back in his jacket pocket, then leaned back, exhaled, and said nothing more. Tomorrow the theater would resume, but tonight the speech had found its spine. The chamber buzzed with the familiar rhythm of routine. Budget debates, time allocations, scripted talking points. Members shuffled papers, aides passed notes, and conversations blurred into a low hum beneath the formalities. It was just another day on the House floor, until it wasn't. J.D. Vance rose quietly from his seat. No one had expected it, not at that moment, not during a standard review session. There had been no headline announcement, no press prelude, just his voice calmly breaking through the procedural haze. "Madam Chair," he said, measured and firm, "I request 5 minutes to address the body." A few heads turned. Frost, seated 2 rows across, glanced up briefly and then back down at his tablet. The chair nodded. "Senator Vance, you have the floor." J.D. walked to the podium with a folder in hand, not the glossy one Frost had distributed, but a plain manila file marked with notes and red pen strokes. He didn't tap the microphone. He didn't clear his throat. He simply began. "Facts matter," he said, his voice steady, "and when they don't, people suffer." The room didn't fall silent, but it paused. A few pens stopped moving. 1 or 2 conversations faded out. J.D. opened the folder and laid the pages on the podium like evidence in a quiet trial. "For the past several months, this body has been told that we've achieved near total success in providing housing access for veterans," he continued. "We've seen numbers, colorful, promising numbers, that paint a picture of progress. But numbers can lie, especially when they're used to hide the truth. He looked up, eyes scanning the room, not searching for agreement, just attention. In Representative Frost's recent report, we were told that veteran housing requests have been fulfilled at 100%. We were told no shelter denials occurred in his district. We were shown turnaround rates, placement graphs, and statements of victory. JD held up a page from the audit. But here's what the numbers didn't show. Recycled data from the previous year labeled as new success. Cross-category bundling that counts youth shelters as veteran services. Funds moved from long-term medical housing into temporary hotel vouchers, then counted twice. Now the chamber quieted, not fully, but noticeably. The buzz had faded. Even Frost looked up now, eyes focused but unreadable. JD continued, turning another page. I'm not accusing anyone of statistical error. This was not an oversight. This was a construction, a narrative built with just enough distance from truth to sell certainty where none exists. He pulled one more document from the file. It was a single-page printout, simple and brutal. And here, he said, holding it up, is a housing request from Zanesville, Ohio, a Vietnam veteran, denied shelter access in November. His name was Raymond Carter. He let the name sit there for a second too long. He died waiting. His wife wrote me a letter that arrived the same day this report was handed to you. She watched that press conference, the one where we were told no one had been turned away, and she cried, because in that moment the system didn't just fail her husband, it erased him. No emotion in his voice, just clarity. Facts matter, JD repeated, because without them, we don't just get bad policy, we get invisible people. He stepped back from the podium, didn't look at Frost, didn't wait for reaction. The room held still, not out of respect yet, but uncertainty. Something had been pierced, a narrative had shifted, and silence once again had begun to say more than words ever could. Maxwell Frost didn't stand immediately. He waited 5 seconds, maybe 6. Just enough time to let the silence stretch into discomfort. Then slowly and deliberately, he rose. He didn't look rattled. He looked polished. Madam Chair, he began, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, I believe it's my turn to respond to the, let's call it commentary, we just heard. He stepped forward with practiced ease. No notes in hand, only confidence. What we've just witnessed is not oversight, he said, scanning the room with an air of calm control. It's not transparency. It's a coordinated smear, a narrative crafted to erode trust in real progress. Murmurs stirred among the chamber. Some nodded subtly, others leaned toward their aides, gauging the political weather. The tension that had hovered after JD's speech began to shift, fragmenting along familiar lines. Frost continued, Senator Vance is using one letter, one, to discredit an entire program, one tragic case, one painful outcome, as proof that the whole system is broken. That's not governance. That's emotional manipulation disguised as moral clarity. His voice remained smooth, measured, almost soothing. It was the tone of someone well-versed in optics, in reframing. We've served thousands, he said. We've housed veterans, modernized applications, and reduced backlog times by nearly 40%. But because one family slipped through, we're all suddenly frauds. He let the question hang just long enough. Frost stepped closer to the committee desk, lowering his voice slightly for emphasis. This isn't about veterans. This is about headlines. This is about using grief as a weapon. It's calculated. It's emotionally exploitative. JD sat motionless. No blink, no frown, no fire. But it stung. Not because it was true, but because Frost knew exactly which words would slice the deepest. Calculated, exploitative. It was the language of reputation, the kind that could taint intention before the facts had time to breathe. JD had been in the room the night he read that letter, the night the truth hit him like a quiet explosion. He hadn't planned for a headline. He hadn't written a press release. He hadn't even called a reporter. But here, in this moment, that didn't matter. Frost was shifting the battlefield, turning defense into offense, recasting the emotional core of JD's speech as political theater. Members of Congress leaned in, some nodding, others stone-faced. The partisan divide grew more visible, like a seam splitting under pressure. A progressive from California whispered something sharply. A moderate from Pennsylvania stared hard at his notes, unwilling to pick a side just yet. Frost closed his remarks with a return to broad strokes. If we weaponize every imperfection, we will paralyze every solution. If we turn tragedy into accusation, then we will drown in blame and forget to build. And with that, he sat. The murmurs rose again, louder this time, like a tide lifting behind him. JD could feel the shift. It wasn't that they didn't hear the truth, it was that they were afraid of what it would cost them to admit it. But he didn't flinch. He had walked into that chamber knowing what it meant to speak the kind of truth that didn't fit neatly on a press release. He knew it would be spun, twisted, flattened into the language of political rivalry. And yet, he also knew something Frost didn't. You can win a room and still lose the ground it's built on. JD didn't stand right away. He let Frost's final words hang there for a beat longer than necessary. The room had started to sway, public opinion forming, partisan defenses activating. The damage control was already moving. And yet JD knew that speeches could be rehearsed, spin could be choreographed, but paper never lies, especially the kind buried so deep it wasn't meant to be read aloud. He reached into the inside of his jacket and pulled out a sealed manila folder, unmarked, unpolished. Its flap had been taped shut twice, the way federal investigators seal things when they're not sure who they're protecting yet. JD laid it flat on the podium and rested his hand on top of it for a moment. Then, without fanfare, he broke the seal. "This isn't about my word versus Representative Frost's," JD began, his tone quieter now, not angry, not triumphant, just deliberate. This audit wasn't partisan. It wasn't drafted by a campaign or filtered through a press office. It was conducted by the Office of Inspector General and then filed away, with no announcement, in a back-end database where no one was supposed to look. JD opened the folder, removed several stapled pages, and flipped to a specific section, marked with a red tab. It was buried. Until now. The chamber hushed. Staffers leaned forward. Members straightened in their chairs. The red camera light blinked again, but it no longer felt like television. It felt like testimony. JD looked down at the page and began to read. In 5 states, reported fulfillment metrics concerning veteran housing access have been materially overstated. Discrepancies between claim placement rates and verified shelter records indicate a reporting inflation of up to 37%. Districts impacted include Florida's 10th, New York's 14th, Pennsylvania's 3rd. He paused there, just long enough. And Ohio's 12th. A quiet ripple passed through the room, not loud enough to be scandal yet, but close. JD turned another page and read again. In District FL10, public statements indicated 0 denials during FY 2024. However, internal correspondence confirms at least 47 applications were either denied or left unresolved past the emergency threshold. He looked up slowly, letting the words settle. Frost sat still, no longer smirking, no longer posturing, just still. JD didn't need to name him. The district had already done it. He continued. These misrepresentations directly impacted budget oversight and obstructed legislative review of service gaps. The recommendations section concludes that selective data omission occurred at the communications level, not due to system error, but by executive discretion. JD stopped reading. He gently closed the folder and placed it back down. Now quiet again. This isn't about blame, he said. It's about responsibility. It's about the people who filled out those applications and were told they'd been heard, only to be erased from the charts presented to you. The chamber was silent, not polite silent, gutted silent. Frost's hands were folded on the desk in front of him, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the carpet. The cameras, sensing something irreversible, began to pan tighter. A slow zoom caught his expression, his shoulders a fraction lower than before, his composure thinning. JD didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for a vote. He simply stepped back from the mic and said one final line. If we can't tell the truth about who we failed, we're going to keep failing them. And then he returned to his seat. Nothing else needed to be said. Not today, because the room already knew. The silence that followed wasn't a pause. It was a reckoning. It started with a PDF, a single file 9 pages long, uploaded anonymously to a policy watchdog blog at 6:37 a.m. Eastern. Within an hour, it had been screenshotted, archived, reposted, annotated, and tweeted by half a dozen Capitol Hill reporters who knew exactly what they were looking at. A sealed audit the public was never supposed to see. By noon, it had a hashtag. Hashtag Frostfile began trending across platforms. Cable networks ran B-roll of the House chamber, while red banners crawled beneath the anchors. New audit suggests misreporting in veterans' housing data. Oversight or omission, Vance versus Frost fallout begins. Talk shows erupted. On one network, a former HUD official spoke with furrowed brow. This isn't just about bad math. It's about trust. Was it a lie or just really convenient neglect? On another, a roundtable of pundits split down party lines. One declared, "This is a hit job from a Senate backbencher with presidential ambitions." Another responded, "Backbencher or not, those numbers were fake." Clips of JD's speech flooded social feeds, most of them beginning with the same sentence. This audit wasn't partisan, it was buried. The footage of Frost's reaction, the slow zoom on his frozen expression, was looped and analyzed like a quarterback after a sack. His team scrambled. By afternoon, Maxwell, Frost's press secretary, released a 2-paragraph statement claiming, "Data discrepancies are being reviewed internally and appear to be the result of miscommunication between third-party reporting entities and staff-level summarization." They used words like clarification and contextual nuance. They promised full transparency moving forward. But damage control rarely outruns momentum. An op-ed appeared in the Washington Tribune titled, "The Math That Lied." Veterans advocacy groups began releasing their own statements. Some measured, others pointed. One read, "You don't get to wave the flag in front of cameras and then forget who it's supposed to be for behind closed doors." Reporters reached out to J.D. Vance's office for interviews. CNN, NPR, Fox, MSNBC. The invitations were polite at first, then persistent. He declined all of them. No press conferences, no sound bites, no retweets. When asked by a local radio station for comment, his office issued a short line. "The story isn't mine to tell. It belongs to the people who were erased by someone else's version of progress." That silence only fed the fire. Some interpreted it as political savvy, others as strategic humility. But inside his office, JD wasn't reading headlines. He was reviewing letters, more of them now, stacked in a box on the side table. Some handwritten, some typed, all of them from veterans or their families. Each one said in some form, "I didn't think anyone would say it out loud." Frost, meanwhile, disappeared from live appearances for 2 days. Rumors swirled of internal infighting, late-night meetings, donors asking quiet questions. The energy had shifted. This wasn't just a policy story anymore. It had become a narrative about something deeper: credibility, character, consequences. Not just the failure of a program, but the illusion of perfection long sold to the public in PowerPoints and patriotic hashtags. And still, JD waited. He didn't need to shout. He'd already spoken. Now the truth was doing its own work, spreading faster than denial, louder than spin. And for the first time in a long while, the noise wasn't drowning out the silence. It was because of the silence. The studio was small, no bigger than a modest kitchen, and smelled faintly of coffee, old equipment, and newsprint. The station, WBXT 104.9, served 3 counties in southeast Ohio and ran on a shoestring budget and loyal listeners. Its walls were lined with faded photographs of veterans holding flags, farmers at town hall meetings, coal workers in dust-covered overalls. It wasn't the kind of place national politicians called back, but JD had called them. He didn't bring staff. No cameras followed him. Just one folder tucked beneath his arm and the same letter from Evelyn Carter still folded inside his jacket. The host, a retired Marine named Hank Daly, greeted him with a handshake rougher than most. "Didn't think we'd get this story from someone who actually walked into the room?" Hank said with a grin. JD smiled politely and sat down across from the mic. Through the window, you could see a water tower in the distance. An American flag flapped lazily from the porch out front. When the red on-air light blinked to life, there was no dramatic introduction, just Hank's familiar voice. Good morning, folks. We're back on WBXT with a special guest, Senator J.D. Vance, joining us from our studio in Chillicothe. Senator, welcome. Glad to be here, J.D. replied calmly. Hank leaned forward. Let's not bury the lead. You shook up the House last week. Why now? J.D. took a breath. Because we can't keep pretending these gaps are technical errors. They're human failures. And they come with names, not just numbers. He adjusted the mic slightly. This wasn't personal. It wasn't political. It was a matter of trust. And if Congress doesn't care about the forgotten, then I have to ask, who will? There was a moment of quiet, not from hesitation, but respect. Then Hank cleared his throat. We've got callers lining up, he said. First one's from Vinton County. You're on the air. The line clicked. A man's voice came through, raspy and slow. Name's Tom. I did 2 tours in Iraq. Been waiting on housing since 2020. I stopped calling 6 months ago. Figured no one was listening. He paused. But last Thursday, I watched your speech on YouTube. Whole thing. Twice. I just wanted to say, you spoke for us. Thank you. JD blinked once, swallowed, then replied softly. Tom, I can't fix what was taken from you, but I can tell the truth about it, and I can keep telling it until it costs something to ignore. Another call came in, then another. A widow in Marietta, a nurse in Portsmouth, an out-of-work mechanic in Jackson whose father never got his VA appointment. None of them were loud, none of them cried, but each voice carried weight, and in each voice was the same message. We thought no one saw us. The host leaned into the mic one last time. Senator, final question. What now? JD looked out the window for a long moment before answering. We get real. No more stage charts. No more borrowed words. No more pretending broken systems are just complicated ones. We say what's wrong, loud and clear, and often. The on-air light dimmed. Outside, the sun had started to break through the gray, and JD stood to leave. He didn't give a press quote. He didn't tweet a soundbite. But inside 100 homes across southern Ohio, radios played on kitchen counters and shop shelves. And in those spaces, the ones political speeches never reached, his voice had landed where it mattered. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to echo off marble. It just needs to be heard once, in the right place, by the right people. The chairs didn't match. Some were plastic, others metal, borrowed from a nearby church basement. The town hall in Chillicothe wasn't built for cameras, and none had been invited. The overhead lights hummed faintly, and someone had brought in a tray of grocery store cookies and a coffee pot that had long since gone lukewarm. There were no banners, no podium, just a circle of folding chairs and a few rows of seats in back. About 30 people had gathered, some veterans, some spouses, some just townsfolk who'd read the paper or heard the radio the day before. J.D. Vance sat among them, not above or apart, but level. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair. His shirt sleeves were rolled. He wasn't here to speak at anyone. He was here to speak with them. After a short introduction by a local organizer, just a few words about truth, dignity, and being seen, J.D. stood slowly, holding a single sheet of paper in his hands. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't a speech. It was a letter. I want to read something, he said. Some of you may have already heard me talk about this, but I haven't read it out loud before, and I think it's time someone did. The room stilled. He unfolded the letter from Evelyn Carter, the widow from Zanesville, whose husband died in a motel room waiting for help that never came. His voice didn't shake, but it wasn't polished either. He read it plainly, quietly, every line. I'm not writing to ask for justice anymore. I've stopped expecting the people in power to remember his name, but when I heard that speech, when I heard them say every veteran got help, I cried, not because it was a lie, but because it made me feel like my husband never existed. He finished the letter and folded it back along the creases. No one clapped. No one needed to. Across the room, people nodded, softly, slowly, the kind of nod that carries memory. One man near the back wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket and spoke into the stillness. "I thought no one would ever say that out loud." JD looked at him, didn't respond with a quote or a line, just a glance that said, "I heard you." Another woman spoke next. "My brother served in the Gulf, died waiting on surgery paperwork. We didn't even get the denial letter until 2 weeks after the funeral." Heads turned toward her, not with surprise, but recognition. These weren't rare stories. They were unspoken ones. For a long time, the room sat in that shared space. No big revelations, no legislative promises, just a slow release of silence that had stretched too long, too far. JD finally spoke again, softer this time. "I didn't come here with a solution in my pocket. I came here with a letter, because someone trusted me enough to tell the truth when they thought no one would care." He paused. "I just want to prove them wrong." As the meeting wound down, people rose slowly, lingering as if unsure whether to return to their regular lives just yet. Some approached him. A few shook his hand. No photo ops, no social media clips. Just thanks, the kind that doesn't always need words. Outside, the sky had turned overcast again. But in that old hall, something had lifted. It wasn't hope, not quite. It was something older. Recognition. And that alone was enough to keep the story alive. The bell had rung 15 minutes ago, but no one in room 214 was checking the clock. It was third period civics at Meadow Creek High, a small-town public school in southern Ohio, where the heat kicked on late and the Wi-Fi worked just enough. The desks were arranged in a semicircle today. On the projector screen at the front of the room, a pause frame showed JD Vance mid-sentence, one hand hovering over a sealed manila folder, his eyes locked straight ahead. The caption on the video read, "This audit wasn't partisan. It was buried." The teacher, Mr. Langford, stepped away from his laptop and turned toward the class of 23 students, sophomores and juniors mostly. A few had their hoods up, a few more leaned forward, elbows on their desks. The room was quieter than usual. They had just finished watching a 6-minute clip of the House hearing, the moment Vance revealed the suppressed audit and read out the denial numbers. "Okay," Mr. Langford said, his tone calm but focused. "Let's talk." A hand went up immediately. It belonged to Noah, a wiry junior in the front row who never spoke unless something genuinely bothered him. "Why would someone lie about veterans?" he asked, his voice level but sincere. "Like, why even do that? What's the point?" The question floated for a moment, heavier than it seemed. A few students glanced around, unsure whether to speak next. Mr. Langford didn't answer right away. He took a seat on the edge of his desk, hands folded. Then he nodded slowly. "Because sometimes," he said, "power rewards the wrong numbers." He let that sit, then added, "Because it's easier to decorate a chart than to face the people behind it. Because it takes 10 seconds to say, 'We've solved it,' and 10 years to admit you haven't." Another hand went up. Tessa, a senior in the back. "But wouldn't they get caught? I mean, they recorded the whole thing, right?" Langford gave a half smile. "Eventually. But by then, the headlines have changed, and people get tired. Outrage doesn't last as long as spin." On the board behind him, someone had written earlier in the period, "Truth isn't loud. It's what stays when the noise is gone." Langford walked over and underlined it. "That's what Vance did in that room," he said. "He stayed quiet long enough for the truth to make its own sound." A few students nodded. One of the football players, arms crossed, muttered, "Still crazy, though, to fake stuff about veterans." Langford looked at him. "It is. But here's the harder part. Most of the people who fake things don't think they're lying. They think they're winning." That line hit differently. The room shifted. Less talk, more thought. He turned off the projector and moved back to the desk. "You won't all go into politics. Most of you won't care about housing data 5 years from now. But here's what matters. Somewhere in your life, you're going to be asked to decorate something ugly and call it progress. Might be numbers, might be words, might be silence." He paused, then looked directly at Noah, the one who asked the first question. "And when that happens, the only thing that'll matter is whether you recognize the difference between making something better or just making it look better." The bell rang. Chairs scraped. backpack zipped, phones came out. But something lingered. Not outrage, not even inspiration. Awareness. And sometimes that's where real change begins. Not with applause, but with a question no one quite knows how to forget. The bell had rung 15 minutes ago, but no one in room 214 was checking the clock. It was third period civics at Meadow Creek High, a small-town public school in southern Ohio, where the heat kicked on late and the Wi-Fi worked just enough. The desks were arranged in a semicircle today. On the projector screen at the front of the room, a pause frame showed J.D. Vance mid-sentence, one hand hovering over a sealed manila folder, his eyes locked straight ahead. The caption on the video read, "This audit wasn't partisan, it was buried." The teacher, Mr. Langford, stepped away from his laptop and turned toward the class of 23 students, sophomores and juniors mostly. A few had their hoods up, a few more leaned forward, elbows on their desks. The room was quieter than usual. They had just finished watching a 6-minute clip of the House hearing. The moment Vance revealed the suppressed audit and read out the denial numbers. "Okay," Mr. Langford said, his tone calm but focused. "Let's talk." A hand went up immediately. It belonged to Noah, a wiry junior in the front row who never spoke unless something genuinely bothered him. "Why would someone lie about veterans?" he asked, his voice level but sincere. "Like, why even do that? What's the point?" The question floated for a moment, heavier than it seemed. A few students glanced around, unsure whether to speak next. Mr. Langford didn't answer right away. He took a seat on the edge of his desk, hands folded. Then he nodded slowly. "Because sometimes," he said, "power rewards the wrong numbers." He let that sit, then added, "Because it's easier to decorate a chart than to face the people behind it. Because it takes 10 seconds to say, 'We've solved it,' and 10 years to admit you haven't." Another hand went up. Tessa, a senior in the back. "But wouldn't they get caught? I mean, they recorded the whole thing, right?" Langford gave a half smile. "Eventually. But by then the headlines have changed, and people get tired. Outrage doesn't last as long as spin." On the board behind him, someone had written earlier in the period, "Truth isn't loud. It's what stays when the noise is gone." Langford walked over and underlined it. "That's what Vance did in that room," he said. "He stayed quiet long enough for the truth to make its own sound." A few students nodded. One of the football players, arms crossed, muttered, "Still crazy, though, to fake stuff about veterans." Langford looked at him. "It is. But here's the harder part. Most of the people who fake things don't think they're lying. They think they're winning." That line hit differently. The room shifted. Less talk, more thought. He turned off the projector and moved back to the desk. "You won't all go into politics. Most of you won't care about housing data 5 years from now. But here's what matters. Somewhere in your life, you're going to be asked to decorate something ugly and call it progress. Might be numbers, might be words, might be silence." He paused, then looked directly at Noah, the one who asked the first question. "And when that happens, the only thing that'll matter is whether you recognize the difference between making something better or just making it look better." The bell rang. Chairs scraped. Backpacks zipped. Phones came out. But something lingered. Not outrage, not even inspiration. Awareness. And sometimes that's where real change begins. Not with applause, but with a question no one quite knows how to forget. The video wasn't filmed in a press room. There were no flags, no backdrop of polished wood or patriotic emblems. Just a blank wall, a houseplant in the corner, and Maxwell Frost seated in a plain gray armchair. No suit jacket, no teleprompter. Just him, his voice, and a carefully balanced sentence. "I want to start by saying I accept full responsibility for the oversight." He paused after that word, oversight, as if it had cost him something to say aloud. He kept his gaze steady, not quite looking into the camera, but close enough to seem sincere. "I accept that the numbers presented didn't match the full picture. That's on me. That's my office. That's my name." He inhaled slowly, visibly steadying himself. "But I reject the idea that I don't care. I reject the implication that because a mistake was made, because a system was imperfect, I am somehow indifferent to the people it failed." His voice cracked ever so slightly, and for a moment, the room behind him seemed to disappear into silence. I've met veterans who sleep in their cars. I've met widows whose letters never got answers. If you think I don't carry that with me every day, you don't know what this job costs. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. I didn't write those audit numbers, but I stood behind them, and for that, I'm sorry. There was no dramatic ending, no music, just a soft click as the recording ended, cutting out a half second before the screen went dark. The video was uploaded at 8:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Within 15 minutes, it had over 100,000 views. By midnight, it had crossed 1 million. The comments were instant, divided, intense. He's human. At least he showed up. Respect. Too late. You stood behind a lie. We needed truth, not tears. This is what accountability looks like. Don't cancel someone who admits fault. He got caught. That's not an apology. That's survival. News outlets clip the emotional moments, especially the part where his voice cracked. Some anchors called it raw, others scripted vulnerability. One commentator said, "It's not what he said, it's what he didn't." In Washington, the response was strategic silence. His allies didn't rush to defend him, but they didn't condemn him either. J.D. Vance, when asked by a reporter for comment, gave only 6 words. "It's not my story to correct." Inside Frost's office, the atmosphere was brittle. His communications team hovered around laptops and analytics dashboards, measuring public sentiment in real time. Staffers whispered in corners. His scheduler quietly postponed 3 appearances without being asked. And Frost? He watched the video playback once. Then he shut the screen and sat there, still for a long while, his hands clasped tight, elbows on his knees. He had spoken. He had said what they told him to say, and a few things he hadn't rehearsed. But something still didn't settle, because deep down, he knew the math hadn't betrayed him. He had betrayed the math. The numbers didn't lie. They obeyed. They bent into shapes that looked like progress and sounded like compassion. But behind those charts were people, and no matter how sincerely he spoke, sincerity didn't refill a denied housing request. Outside, the Capitol lights glowed over an uneasy city. Somewhere in the country, someone was still sleeping in their car. Somewhere else, a widow was wondering if her letter had ever been opened. And Frost sat there in the dark, unsure if one apology, no matter how honest, could reach the people who had already stopped listening. The building was quieter than usual. Not the grand camera-ready silence of hearings or chambers, but the softer kind. The kind that settles into carpet fibers and closed doors when a long week has finally exhaled. J.D. Vance sat alone in his office. The lights were low, the blinds drawn halfway. Outside, the dusk had thinned into gray, and Washington buzzed faintly behind thick glass. He'd canceled the last meeting on his schedule, not because he was tired, though he was, but because something needed writing. Not for the press, not for the record, just for his people. He reached across his desk and pulled out a small legal pad, the yellow kind with faint blue lines and a bent corner. His pen hovered for a moment before landing near the top. He didn't pause for effect. He wasn't planning to edit it. He wrote in block letters, "Don't turn this into a victory lap." Then beneath it, smaller, "We didn't win. A man still died waiting. A widow still wrote that letter." He sat back, read the lines once, then folded the paper in half and left it on the corner of the desk where his staff would see it in the morning. He reached for the bottom drawer, the one he'd opened and closed half a dozen times since the hearing, and gently slid it open. Inside sat Evelyn Carter's letter, still folded along its creases, still lined with underlines and shaky blue ink. He stared at it for a long moment. Then with slow hands, he picked it up once more. His thumb traced the edge of the page as if reminding himself it was real, that it wasn't policy, that it wasn't a talking point, that it came from someone who had lost something no speech could restore. He exhaled, whispered aloud, no one to hear him but himself. The goal was never to win, it was to hear her. With care, he folded the letter once more and placed it gently back in the drawer. Then he closed it, not with finality, but with reverence, like sealing a promise. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle in. Somewhere out there, Frost's video was still being dissected by pundits. His name was still trending, Analysts were counting followers gained and lost, estimating how much damage had been done and how long it might last. But none of that lived in this office. In here, there were no graphs, no bounce-back plans, just a small yellow note and a single letter from a woman who never asked for headlines. Only honesty. JD glanced at the corner of his desk where the folder had sat during the hearing. It was gone now, filed away. But he could still see it. He could still hear the moment the room fell silent. Not because of how he'd said something, but because of what he'd finally read out loud. He stood, stretched once, then turned off the light. As he walked to the door, he looked back, just for a second, at the drawer. Then he left the office with nothing in his hands. Because some victories aren't carried, they're remembered. The door shut with a soft, deliberate click. No cameras, no press, just the low hum of recycled air and the faint scratch of a notepad somewhere at the end of the long mahogany table. J.D. Vance sat in the center seat, his posture firm but not stiff, his jacket still dusted with the remnants of a hurried morning. Around him, the committee members took their places, senators, aides, legal observers, all sworn to confidentiality. Their expressions were measured, but not unreadable. Some looked tired. A few looked ready for blood. This was the hearing nobody would ever see on C-SPAN. The committee chair, a seasoned senator with a reputation for nonpartisanship and sharp memory, cleared his throat. Senator Vance, thank you for agreeing to this testimony under closed session. Let's proceed. J.D. nodded once. Of course. He spoke without notes, without flourish, just facts. The audit revealed deliberate misclassification of housing data across 5 states, he began. Inconsistent terminology was used to disguise denials as fulfilled applications. When tracked longitudinally, the numbers do not reflect improvements, but repackage failures. A staffer in the back tapped at a keyboard. Another flipped through a printed appendix. J.D. continued, his voice steady. This is not a matter of partisan overreach or personal vendetta. This is bigger than one name or one scandal. It's about who gets forgotten when no one's watching, when oversight becomes optional. One senator interjected, a Democrat from the coast. Are you saying Frost ordered this misrepresentation directly? J.D. met his eyes without blinking. I'm saying the system rewarded silence. Whether it was deliberate deception or willful ignorance, the outcome was the same. Veterans didn't get homes, and Congress got credit. A long pause followed, not hostile, just heavy. Then a Republican from the Midwest leaned forward, hands clasped. And you? What do you want from this hearing? J.D. looked down for a moment, then back up. I want institutional memory, he said. I want this recorded, not buried. So 10 years from now, no one says, we didn't know. A few heads nodded, others remained still. He let the silence fill the room, not afraid of it. In fact, he preferred it, because silence meant they were finally listening. I have no interest in headlines, J.D. added, but I'll tell you what I do want. I want the widow from Chillicothe to know her letter didn't disappear into a shredder. I want the staffer who flagged the numbers to know it mattered. I want the next person who sees a lie dressed as a success story to know. If they speak up, someone will stand with them. A legal advisor whispered something to the chair. The senator nodded, then addressed the room. We've heard what we need today. We'll deliberate privately. J.D. rose from his seat, gathered nothing, and gave a single nod to the chair. As he stepped into the hallway, the door closing behind him, he realized something. There had been no applause, no backpats, no press waiting outside, just the echo of his own footsteps down the marble corridor. And yet, it was one of the most honest rooms he'd spoken in, because sometimes the truth didn't need to echo through a chamber. It just needed to be written down, so it couldn't be erased. The room wasn't large, just a side chamber 2 floors beneath the Capitol Rotunda. But it felt full. No grand cameras, no elected officials giving speeches. Just 4 folding chairs and 4 veterans who had something to say. A modest sign outside read, Veteran Housing Oversight Listening Panel. Inside, the walls were lined with notepads, laptops, and quiet press. No one interrupted. No one postured. The first to speak was Sergeant Laura Mendoza, Army retired. She sat upright, medals pinned but blouse modest, her voice clear. Let me start with this, she said, looking straight ahead. We're not looking for heroes. We're looking for honesty. No applause, just the quiet weight of truth settling into the air. She unfolded a printed copy of the most recent budget report and held it in the air. I've read this front to back, she said, and I still can't find where my platoon leader's denial letter fits in. I buried him 3 months ago. The report says he was housed. He wasn't. Next was Corporal Jamal Bishop, Navy. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his mic. I served on 3 deployments. I came home thinking the country would give me a fair shot. Applied for veteran housing 3 times. Got rejected all 3. He held up a copy of one of his letters. Reason listed, insufficient urgency. There was a rustle from the press row. J.D. Vance, seated quietly near the back wall, didn't move. Then came the third voice. A young man in a pressed uniform jacket, sitting stiffly, every word measured. I'm Lance Corporal Devontae Reed, he began. Marines. Honorable discharge, 2022. He reached into his folder and pulled out a single page. Handwritten, slightly creased. This was the letter I got last October, he said, after waiting 6 months for housing in my home state. He cleared his throat. The letter says I wasn't eligible because I was transitional, not permanent. Like I was a phase. His voice cracked. He paused. A long silence followed. No one rushed him. J.D. leaned forward slightly but said nothing. Reed finally continued. But I filled every form, did every step. You don't get to serve your country and then be told your homelessness is a paperwork issue. He finished reading and gently folded the letter again. His hands shook slightly as he placed it back in the folder. The last to speak was Master Sergeant Alan Cho, Air Force, 25 years in uniform. He didn't bring papers or files. He looked out at the reporters. I didn't come here to vent, he said. I came here because numbers don't bleed. People do. A murmur rippled through the room. Cho pointed behind him, to the veterans seated quietly in the rows, to the Gold Star wives in the corner. This conversation isn't new, he said. It's just that this time, someone finally listened. Across the room, J.D. Vance met Cho's eyes for a moment. Neither of them nodded. They didn't need to. As the panel wrapped, no grand statement was issued. No press release followed. But as reporters filed out, many left their questions unasked. They had what they needed. Sometimes a cracked voice was louder than a shouted speech. And sometimes the truth didn't arrive through a scandal, but through the simple act of reading a letter out loud. The room looked the same. Same long mahogany table. Same brushed microphones. Same quiet murmur as nameplates were set into place. But one detail stood out. An empty chair. Maxwell Frost's nameplate was there, but he wasn't. No official statement. No announcement. Just silence. He had quietly withdrawn from the Veterans Subcommittee the night before. Not even a press release. Just a memo filed at 9:47 p.m. The room felt colder without him, as if even his defenders didn't know how to fill the space he left behind. J.D. Vance arrived early. He wore no pin, carried no papers, just a single folded sheet in his breast pocket. The same letter. The widow's words written in careful, looping ink. When roll was called and the meeting opened, the chair next to J.D. stayed untouched. Midway through the discussion, housing allocations in rural regions, J.D. slowly reached into his pocket and placed the letter on the empty desk. He didn't say anything, didn't call attention to the act. No cameras panned, no dramatic music played. It just sat there briefly, a single page. The kind of paper that weighed more than any spreadsheet. Some eyes caught it. One aide near the back lowered their pen. A congressional reporter glanced up but didn't raise a question. After a moment, J.D. reached forward, gently folded the letter, and tucked it back into his jacket. He didn't need to speak. The point had been made. The hearing continued. Amendments proposed, data exchanged, motion seconded. But through it all, the image lingered. One seat, left empty. One voice preserved in silence. And beneath it all, the question that wouldn't go away. Who else had been left off the record? The sky was gray over the small steel town in Ohio, the kind of weather that kept voices low and movements slower. But even muted skies couldn't dull what was about to be unveiled. Along the edge of a decommissioned milliard, Where furnaces once roared and men had clocked in before dawn, a new structure stood waiting. A memorial wall, 15 feet long, carved from recycled steel. No flags, no speeches, no podium, just names. 200 names. Each one belonged to a veteran denied housing benefits between 1987 and 2022. Some were known, most weren't. Their stories had been lost in paperwork, in formulas that prioritized budget over dignity. J.D. Vance stood at the back of the crowd, unnoticed by most. He wore no suit, just a dark coat, collar up against the wind. His eyes scanned the names, but he didn't search for anything specific. He had already memorized them all. Beside the wall, a small folding chair waited for her. The widow. She stepped forward, hands trembling but steady enough to hold a single flower. Pale yellow, her husband's favorite. She didn't speak. Just knelt down, placed it beneath his name, line 87, and whispered something only she and the steel could hear. The crowd remained silent. A few shifted in place. One child clutched a small American flag but didn't wave it. A retired Marine in uniform saluted. His hand stayed at his brow longer than necessary. Then came the sound. Not applause, not a bugle. The sound of footsteps as people began to walk the length of the wall, each name demanding its moment. J.D. stayed until the last person left. He approached the wall slowly and ran his fingers across the iron. It was cold and permanent. It arrived with no fanfare. Just a small, nondescript envelope postmarked from D.C., dropped into the usual stack of policy updates and constituent requests. J.D. recognized the handwriting before he opened it. Maxwell Frost. Inside, a single sheet. Typed, neat, precise. You were right, I failed. Not because of a vote or a headline, but because I forgot what the numbers were supposed to stand for. J.D. read the letter twice, then a third time. There was no defensiveness, no deflection. Only an admission few in public life ever gave. You didn't humiliate me. You held me accountable. That's rarer than truth. At the bottom, a final sentence stood alone. They deserved better than I gave them. J.D. underlined that line in blue ink, then folded the letter and opened the drawer in his desk. Inside, the widow's handwritten note still sat, edges worn from being read too many times. He placed Frost's letter beside it. Not over it, just next to it. 2 voices, 1 story. The office was quiet save for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the Capitol buzzed on as usual. Debates, sound bites, strategy. But inside that drawer was a moment no camera had caught. A moment when accountability finally spoke, without needing to shout. J.D. walked alone down a narrow street in rural Kentucky. 1 store open, a barber shop closed for good. The sound of gravel under his shoes kept him grounded. No entourage, no camera crew. Just the air, brisk and quiet. A child on a rusted bike pedaled past him, slowed, then turned. You're the guy who stood up, the boy said, squinting. J.D. didn't correct him, didn't ask how he knew. He just nodded with a small smile. The boy kept riding, the bike squeaking every third turn. J.D. paused beside a boarded-up storefront and looked at his own reflection in the dusty window. He thought of the hearings, the folders, the letter, the wall. He thought of all the voices that never made it into the record. Then softly, almost to himself, I didn't come here to win arguments. I came to say one thing clearly, so the ones who can't speak anymore won't be forgotten. No victory parade, no closing anthem, just a man walking home with silence behind him. But somehow, that silence stayed. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't loud. It's steady, honest, and willing to carry the quiet burdens others forget. J.D.'s journey wasn't about headlines or winning debates. It was about restoring dignity to the names buried in bureaucracy. The moment that lingers most isn't the confrontation, but the walk home, when silence means something has changed. In a world obsessed with noise and optics, this chapter offers a different kind of legacy, one built on listening, not shouting. What about you? Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of courage that stayed with you long after the moment passed? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.